Do you solemnly swear that in all things appertaining to the trial of the impeachment of Donald John Trump, President of the United States, now pending, you will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws, so help you God?
Chief Justice John Roberts swearing in senators last week to formally begin the impeachment trial of President Trump. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. We'll talk impeachment and much more with Representative Carolyn Maloney, the new chairwoman of the powerful House Oversight and Reform Committee, in just a moment. Also on our agenda, a double header from the New York Times. The paper shocks a lot of people and endorses two candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination. We'll talk with Deputy Editorial Page Editor Kathleen Kingsbury about the decision. But we begin with the big story in Washington, only the third presidential impeachment trial in American history now underway. Democrats and Republicans bitterly clashing over rules for the trial, as well as over to call witnesses and seek more documents. And there's still controversy over House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's decision to delay for a month sending the articles of impeachment to the Senate. Carolyn Maloney is one of the committee chairs the Speaker tasked with drafting those articles, and she was first elected to Congress in 1992, represents the 12th District in Manhattan and Queens. Welcome and thanks
Brooklyn.
for joining us. And Brooklyn, I don't want to forget
All
Brooklyn.
over the place.
My home borough. Congresswoman, how can you hold a trial? This is sort of a rhetorical question to a Democrat. How can you hold a trial without witnesses and with the Chief Justice, as we saw, swearing in people who have already said that Donald Trump is innocent, and now they're swearing to be impartial?
Well, I agree with you completely. Democrats totally support getting all the evidence and having as many witnesses that are pertinent and important. Certainly Bolton and Mitch Mulvaney and others should testify, and we are trying to, hopefully the decision will be that they will be allowed to testify and other evidence will be given. But it is outrageous that Mitch McConnell has been so outspoken that he is just going to do what the president wants. Well, if he's just going to do what the president wants, he should just resign and get out of the Senate. The Senate is supposed to be a check on the balance of powers of our nation, the legislative branch, the judicial and the executive. But for so many of them to say that he's innocent and that they have made up their minds, and it's wrong. It's disrespectful to the American people, and it's disrespectful to the Constitution. The American people deserve to hear a real trial with real evidence and impartial judges.
If the Senate does not vote to remove the president, which appears to be likely at this point, doesn't Donald Trump have the right to claim he's been vindicated, and doesn't that turn into a political asset for him?
I don't think so. He's been impeached. He's been impeached by the United States Congress. And he's one of three presidents, as you said, to be impeached. And the evidence was uncontested and overwhelming. And if they think he's so innocent, why don't they put some facts out that show that he's innocent? They haven't. All they've said is that we're going to get through this as quickly as possible, and we've already made up our minds. It doesn't instill any confidence in the Senate or the Republican Party.
Explain to our viewers the role of Justice Roberts. As he once said, nobody goes to a ball game to see an umpire. But what prerogatives, what latitude does he have to say how this trial works?
Well, he's presiding over it. He can be like Rehnquist and not say anything or do anything. And Rehnquist famously said that he was there to observe and he didn't really do anything. But already he has spoken out, particularly in the dust-up with Chairman Nadler, and called for more appropriate language and decorum. People, I think, were tired and get testy late into the night, but he certainly exerted some leadership and command over the situation. It'll be interesting if he will come out with any instructions or if he will come out with any guidance. It'll be interesting to see. He's surprised us before. Many people thought that the Supreme Court would be totally partisan on the citizenship question that was added illegally, according to the papers that we've seen. We've subpoenaed those papers. That's before the Supreme Court now from Secretary Ross. But he decided that the citizenship question should be removed, that it was illegally added to the census with an unjustified reason and other language, but he did remove it. And that was a victory, I think, for democracy and the American people. So I don't know what he's going to do. He may not even know himself, but we'll find out very soon.
The House voted to make it clear what the war powers of the president are after the drone attack. Nothing is going to happen with that legislation in the Senate, presumably, like so much other legislation that has gone over from the House. Don't you get frustrated after a while that all that just sits there?
It's very frustrating. We have over 275 bills, but it sent an important message. It made it clear that only Congress has the power to declare war. And it sent a message to the president to keep us out of any reckless war. And once it gets through the House, you're moving closer. It's an important milestone to pass out of the Senate. And this year I've passed 5 bills that have gone through the House and the Senate and signed into law. So it can be done. And a lot of it depends on the will of the American people and the amount of pressure that comes from the electorate to act. I find it unconscionable that Leader McConnell has let so many important statements that so many people care about in this country not be acted on.
One of the bills you're pushing is requiring education about the Holocaust. Can you really teach people not to hate?
Well, this is a bill that I'm a former teacher, so I see the answer to a lot of problems is education and tolerance and understanding. And it gained a lot of interest recently in our great city when roughly 3 weeks ago we had 13 acts of violence in 2 weeks. It was just almost unheard of. One was breaking into a rabbi's home with a machete and slashing people and beating up people on the street. Just behavior that I've never seen before. And we are all talking about what can we do about it. And I think one approach, it's not the only approach, and this bill is going to pass on Monday, and I believe will pass in the Senate too. We have a large number of senators on the bill, and it's a Holocaust Remembrance Day for the liberation of Auschwitz. And many survivors are coming to Congress. And I think they'll be very pleased that we're passing the bill. It would create a centralized database of lesson plans that are appropriate for kindergarten through high school on tolerance, anti-Semitism, anti-bigotry, understanding, acceptance. And the numbers that the Anti-Defamation League put out recently after all of this violence that showed that a large number of young people don't even know about the Holocaust. They don't even know what it is. They don't know anything about Auschwitz. They don't know, most of them believe that Hitler came to power through some power struggle, throwing people out, not that he was actually elected.
Democratically.
Yeah, and how fragile that is. And so it's something that can be very helpful. There was a big fight about where it should be placed. Many people didn't think it should be in the Department of Education. So we negotiated a deal actually with the Holocaust Museum. It has to be a federally mandated organization. They are going to monitor it and maintain it and reach out. It's also a grant program for innovative ways to teach understanding. And the main point is, if you're a teacher any place in the country, you can access this database and get help and assistance on how you can approach these challenges in your own neighborhoods.
Let's turn to the Democratic primary for a minute. 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton beat Bernie Sanders. Why is she beating him up now? Should she just butt out of this campaign?
Well, we live in a free country, Sam, and
Yeah, we
everybody can say and do whatever they want.
But isn't this
That's
being
part
counterproductive
it's
or
part
not?
Of it's part of our freedom to be able to speak out, and it's a freedom that our forefathers fought for. She's entitled to her point of view, and we're entitled to ours. I personally believe we should focus on the candidates that are there and assess their strengths and weaknesses and get the best candidate possible to defeat the present president.
And who is that?
I'm still looking at that, talking to my colleagues. You'll know very quickly, I think, after the Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina, then you have Super Tuesday, where you have a large number of big and diverse states, and 40% of the delegates will be allocated by then.
Should it be someone who could beat Trump or someone who would make the best president?
Ideally, it should be who would be the best president. But I'm a pragmatic idealist, and you can't implement any policies if you can't win. So for me, I began my career as a program analyst, working for electeds and writing legislation, and I thought it was all very important. Then we couldn't pass any of it. Then I got more interested in helping people get elected so that they could actually implement the policies, or in this case, in many cases, stop the policies of Donald Trump.
Thanks to Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney. And up next, the New York Times endorses 2 candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination. You'll hear what was behind that decision coming up. The New York Times stunned pundits and political junkies, not only publishing an endorsement in the Democratic presidential race before any votes were cast, also endorsing 2 candidates, Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar. The Times editorial board spent hours speaking to the candidates. Here's a sample of those conversations.
Why don't talented people want to continue to work for you?
But they do. But I have beaten like 19 people, including every governor. And so you can't run a presidential campaign if you have a dysfunctional work environment.
I think the old left-right division, yeah, there's a lot of that. But I think there's a very different division in America. And that is an America that's working for a thinner and thinner slice at the top and not working for much of anyone else.
In its endorsement, the Times wrote about the split between moderates and progressives. Quote, both the radical and realist models warrant serious consideration. If there were ever a time to seek stability, now is it. That's why we are endorsing the most effective advocates for each approach. They are Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar. The Times' Kathleen Kingsbury, heavily involved in the candidate interviews as well as the endorsement decision itself. She's the deputy editorial page editor, a Pulitzer Prize winner. Katie, I thought the Times did a terrific job on nytimes.com explaining the background of the endorsement, amazingly transparent in the candidate interviews, all of which are still online. But explain to me, isn't endorsing 2 candidates self-defeating?
I don't see it as self-defeating. I think one of the most important reasons to do an endorsement period is to help voters make up their own minds. And what we really wanted to do with this endorsement process is to welcome voters into the boardroom with us as we interviewed candidates. So we put the full transcripts online. We also have a new podcast, The Choice, and voters can hear us asking questions and make up their own minds. We ultimately feel like we want to inform voters, and looking at the full Democratic field, this felt like the right approach, talking about the 2 different options available to voters and choosing a candidate that best represents those approaches.
James Bennett, our editorial page editor, wrote online, where there is deep disagreement in the editorial board, we sometimes have to call a vote. Did that happen in this case, if I could ask?
Yeah, we did have a vote. If you watch the episode of The Weekly, you see that at the end. But ultimately, because James has recused himself, his brother, Michael Bennett, is running for president, it came down to me, and I made the final decision to endorse the 2 candidates. But the 2 candidates reflect the closest reflection of the vote that we had.
And how much of the decision was based, as we asked Carolyn Maloney earlier, on who would make the best president versus who can beat Donald Trump?
I think right now, at this moment, you mentioned it's quite early in the race. The Times actually endorsed in the 2016 primary at the same time, so this is not unprecedented. But we are very early in the race, and I think it's pretty much a fool's errand to try to determine who could beat Donald Trump at this point. So we did look at electability. That's obviously a central question on voters' minds, but we were really primarily focused on who would be the best president, who was laying out the clearest plan for governing the nation as president, and also who could help unite the country after President Trump.
And who makes the ultimate decision, and what role, if any, does the publisher himself play?
I obviously consulted the publisher, but the decision was mine.
And again, how much of this is a consensus of the board as opposed to you making the decision on your own? And how do you sleep nights making a decision like that?
It was a really big decision. I spent a lot of time. I poured through the transcripts. I talked to a lot of activists. I went to Iowa. I talked to voters. It was a really tough decision. I ultimately decided to lean on the wisdom of the board, and these were the candidates that received the top votes from the board.
Now, what happens as the primaries move along? Is it possible that one or more of these candidates drop out or are edged out in the running? Do we make another endorsement?
I don't think so. That would be fairly unprecedented. We will obviously endorse in the general election, but I've never heard of a newspaper issuing another endorsement. I think it's inevitable that the field is going to narrow, but I think that until the voters actually have a chance to go to the ballot box, it's probably too soon to make predictions around that.
The editorial said there's a lack of a single powerful moderate voice. Wouldn't we include former Mayor Bloomberg in that category?
So we did consider Mayor Bloomberg. He declined to come and be interviewed by the board. He said that he had not yet formed enough opinions on various issues. Remember, this was all happening in early December.
Right.
So we were having these conversations. The Bloomberg team did originally schedule an interview, but they ultimately canceled it. I think that the mayor has one of the clearest track records of governing out of this group. I have a lot of misgivings on how he's running this race, though. You know, he's poured $250 million
So
far, exactly, in television ads. He's skipping Iowa and New Hampshire. He doesn't seem to be doing a lot of on-the-ground campaigning yet beyond opening large campaign offices. And then there's just the relationship that he's had with the media so far. He seems to have really he's more or less banned investigations by his own news organization. He hasn't taken the tough questions from our editorial board. And he's also refused to release women who have non-disclosure agreements with him to talk freely to the press. And all of that gave us a lot of pause. I have you can see it in the polls already that the mayor is making a strong case for his presidency. And I'm really interested to see how things move going forward. But he really didn't feel like someone we could consider for our endorsement at this point.
Obviously, most members of the editorial board, at least I'm assuming it, came into these conversations with some preconceptions. Yeah. Do you think talking to the candidates, listening to the candidates changed many minds? I
think it absolutely did. In fact, actually, I would disagree with the premise of your question. I think that most of us really had no idea who we should endorse going into these conversations. And sitting down for 90 minutes with a candidate and being able to ask them any question that you want and really talk in depth about proposals that they have presented, as well as things like foreign policy, which we haven't gotten to in depth in most of the debates. We saw a lot of things about the candidates that we weren't expecting. And I think probably the clearest example of that is Amy Klobuchar's case that she made for her own candidacy. I think that because of where she has been in the polls, she probably wasn't in kind of the top two of any of the board members going in. But the reality is that she came in and she wowed us. And in addition to that, we went back and looked at the numbers, and John Kerry was still in single digits at this point in the race as well, back in 2003. So we had to consider her candidacy a little bit more closely than I think we probably thought going into the process.
Spencer Bochat-Lindell said that a number of people were much more impressed with Andrew Yang, seeing him in person. Is that because someone like Andrew Yang, forgive me for saying this because it's only January, is so low in the polls that he had less to lose and could say more of what he wanted to say?
That's an interesting question. I mean, Andrew Yang brings complete delight into everything that he does on the campaign trail and in our endorsement meeting. And there's a little bit of that optimism that is infectious. He also has just clearly been on the trail. Like, he has been talking to voters for months now. And a lot of the policies that he's adopted really come from that back and forth with candidates. You know, the Yang Gang is famously kind of fanatical. And you know, I heard over time and time again when I was in Iowa, people who were really impressed by the fact that he wasn't from Washington. He hadn't been there before, yet he was presenting new, interesting ideas. You know, at the end of the day, though, he has no government or military experience. And we already have a president who have those credentials going into office. And, you know, I think that that was what gave us a lot of pause.
Katie, I think it was David Leonard who said that you wrote a 2,000-word draft of a Biden endorsement, then decided it felt very wrong for the moment. A, does that mean you were leaning toward endorsing Biden?
Yeah.
And B, why did it feel wrong?
So I think as tensions escalated with Iran in early January, I woke up one morning and I thought to myself, through the endorsement interviews, the person who had the clearest experience on foreign policy was Vice President Biden. He had been in the Situation Room before. He had had to make tough decisions. And he was also a voice of reason around sending more troops to Afghanistan and Iraq during the Obama administration. And you know, to say I wrote the endorsement was not to suggest that I agree with every stance that Vice President Biden had, but there's a certain comfort in having someone with that kind of experience back in the White House. Then I wrote the editorial, and I did a little bit more research, and I looked at more closely at Amy Klobuchar's record. She had to take a couple of really tough votes while she's been in the Senate on Syria and Libya. And I looked more closely at Elizabeth Warren, who has also had to take tough votes, but also she really has such a strong sense of how to rebuild the alliances. And I realized that experience is not everything, and it just didn't quite feel right. I think one of my hesitations with Vice President Biden is so much of his message is about we need to beat Donald Trump and then we need to restore America back to the normal that existed before Trump. But he hasn't really defined what normal is. And for a lot of people, that normal wasn't working. We see that, obviously, with the election of Trump. And so I don't necessarily think his message matches the urgency of this moment.
A quick one-word answer, if you can, a totally unfair question. Who would you vote for, Warren or Klobuchar?
I don't know. I say that completely honestly. I think that I was saying to David Leonhardt that if an asteroid dropped on Washington, D.C. and I had to choose from the field, I would gravitate towards Warren. But that's not thinking about electability at all, or how to beat Trump in November. And so I know you asked me for a one-word answer, but my answer is I'm not 100% sure.
I can understand. Thanks to Kathleen Kingsbury of the New York Times, and I'll add my thoughts on CODA next. 4 years ago, Donald Trump boasted that his supporters were so loyal that if he shot someone on Fifth Avenue, he wouldn't lose a single vote. His personal lawyer argued last fall that if Trump followed through on his boast, he couldn't be prosecuted as president. Both claims suggest a decriminalization of what used to be called official corruption. Let's put aside the so-called impeachment trial in the Senate, a trial without witnesses or evidence, a trial in which senators who have already publicly declared Trump innocent have since sworn an oath to be impartial. Last week, justices of the Supreme Court suggested that causing a monumental traffic jam on the George Washington Bridge to punish a political opponent might have been scandalous and distasteful, but not criminal. The court seemed sanguine that public officials often lie about their motives, just like a mayor who makes sure his street is plowed first after a snowstorm. It's really undesirable, Justice Breyer said, and maybe it should be a crime, but right now, Arguably, it isn't. When the court overturned the corruption conviction of Virginia Governor Bob McConnell, Justice Roberts invoked a similar standard. Taking luxury gifts, loans, and vacations for helping a businessman was distasteful, the justice said, but merely setting up a meeting on the businessman's behalf does not constitute an official act. That's how former Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver has avoided prison since he was first charged with corruption 5 years ago. This week, a judge ruled that one of the counts on which he was convicted was too vague, that, quote, any official who accepts a thing of value and later acts to benefit of the donor in any manner could be vulnerable to criminal prosecution. In a blatant appeal to Latinos, Governor Cuomo wants to add the slogan E pluribus unum to the state's official seal. Let's take a poll like we did for license plates. Given that there's less tolerance these days for immigration than for corruption, I'd vote for quid pro quo instead. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.